Hello.
Hi, Brendan.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, good. You've come straight into the live session, but that's okay, no problem. I'm just going to move Deborah in as well.
Oh.
There was a backstage.
Sorry, I didn't realize that.
But it's okay. We're now live. So welcome everybody to the Australian session of our one-to-one dialogues, which is forming part of the Pacific Basin Economic Council's annual Dialogue Summit 2022. And I'm delighted to have some familiar faces on this particular webinar. We have my former immediate past CEO of PBEC, Deborah Biber, who's now the CEO at the Australia-ASEAN Chamber of Commerce, which is fabulous to have you in charge of that organization. It's so relevant for Australia, and with your experience, it's going to do some wonderful things and continue its great positioning in connecting Australia with all of these hugely important economies, which are growing at rapid pace on the back of recent, things that we've been talking about this morning, all about supply chain realignment and sourcing. But it's not just manufacturing, there's also technological advancements in all of these countries, and very exciting times to be in the region. But it does also throw up a lot of challenges. And I think Australia is very familiar with challenges, both whether it's climate related, economic related. And I think we'll hear today from Dr. Brendan Ryan, who's the Chief Economist of KPMG Australia, on some of these areas. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to hand over to the pair of you, and I will go into silent mode and look forward to a wonderful conversation. So over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Brendan, for joining me today. Mike, thank you for the invitation. And I'm thrilled to be part of PBEC's annual Dialogue Summit. PBEC is, I sit on PBEC board, and I did run the organization for a while. Mike, I must say you've done the most magnificent job today, and all kudos to you. But we're here to talk about Australia, not me. And we're here to, I'm going to set the scene, and then Brendan and I are going to have a chat about what's really happening in this country. And it's very interesting, that Mike just said that he thinks it's important that Australia, gets itself involved in the Asia-Pacific and definitely in ASEAN. Well, I'm here to tell you that, in fact, we are involved. We've been involved for a very long time. Next year, 2024, sees the 50th anniversary of Australia-ASEAN relations. This year sees the 50th anniversary of Australia-China relations. So as I said, we've been around for a long time, but I'm just going to set the scene for you very quickly. And to my mind and my way of thinking, Australia is a land of enormous contradictions. It's a country that's the size of the United States, and it has a population of only 7% of the United States. So it's very teeny, very large geographically, very small in terms of population numbers. But of that population that we have, and Brendan will go into this, I think, a little bit later, but nearly half of Australians have a parent that was born overseas, and nearly 30% of that half were actually born outside of Australia, which makes us really a truly multicultural country. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that 6% of the entire population of Australia is actually of Asian descent. So given that, and our geography, which really is part of the appeal, if you like, in a Pan-Asian context, is that our Perth, the capital of Western Australia, is the same flight time to Singapore as it is to Sydney. And Darwin, which is in the north, is literally half the time to Bali by flight, Bali in Indonesia, as it is to Sydney. So geographically, we're in that space. The geographical proximity is really, it's undeniable. And Australia's historically traditional markets of the UK and which is 18 hours away, and the more recent past, the US, which is 14 hours to the West Coast. They're tough going, whereas ASEAN is our neighborhood, and Asia-Pacific is our playground. Australia's top 10 trading partners are, of the 10, only 2 are outside our immediate vicinity, and which is showing a definite sort of shift in focus that's been taking place over a number of years. Brendan, a couple of points to support all of that, if you would, and I'll come to some questions for you. But I think just an overview of where Australia's at from an export point of view,
Sure.
both in terms of maybe goods and services now, if you could speak to that.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for that introduction. Certainly, as you pointed out, Australia has a relatively small population, not only within the region, but also globally. We only have a population of about 26 million people. And so while that's relatively small compared to powerhouse economies like China, for example, United States, India, we still rank relatively highly in terms of our economics, how large we are from an economic perspective. We're actually ranked 13th in the world. To put that in context, our GDP in Australia is about $1.3 trillion in US dollar terms. Other APAC countries that are also in that list around us include South Korea, for example, that's 1.6 trillion, and Indonesia, that's 1.1 trillion. When you have a look at us on a per capita basis, again, we punch pretty high, per capita income of around 52,000 US dollars per person. And really, it's only those countries that are geographically small, population small, but are either resource rich, have petrodollars, or are banking hubs, or have some form of other comparative advantage, like Singapore, for example, that really outperform Australia. Again, within the region where we sit is slightly less than Brunei and Hong Kong, and a little bit more than Taiwan and South Korea. So again, we are an economically diverse country, but are characterized really for quite some time as a small open economy. Australia really is dependent on globalization and trade for its prosperity, not only trade, but also inward and outward bound investment. Export represents around 20%, 21% of our GDP, and our imports, we import around 20% of GDP. So in really simple terms, what that means is that our outbound trade of the things that we produce in our own natural endowments allow us to buy in the things that other people produce well and we don't. So, the old story of comparative advantage. Australia's outward focus really stepped up in the early 1980s, and the importance of global trade to Australia really doubled in the last 40 years. Not only can you see that in our trade statistics, but you also see it in our approach to FTAs as well. Prior to the start of the new century, Australia only had one FTA, and that was with our direct neighbour, New Zealand. By the end of the first decade in this century, we had 5 more. If you include the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA that was actually signed and operating on the 1st of January 2010. In that last decade, 2010 to 20, we had 7 more, and we've got another 7 that are underfoot at the moment in various stages of development. So all in all, trade is very important to Australia. And as you mentioned, 3/4 of our bilateral trade occurs with APEC countries. Predominantly, that trade is a little bit more biased to exports than there is with imports. But what that says in terms of balancing that trade gap is that we really should be looking to our Asian neighbours to help in terms of markets for us to be importing goods and services from into the near term. Australia has also been a major importer of foreign capital. We simply don't have enough domestic savings to be able to fund all the opportunities that we have available to us. We're the 14th largest recipient of FDI inbound globally, and regionally only Singapore, China and Hong Kong attract more investment than Australia does. We're also a major player in terms of investing overseas, slightly more FDI outbound than inbound. And again, it's those three countries where our FDI goes. So on the whole, you know, we are very much a trading nation dependent on interactions with the rest of the world, particularly our Asian and Pacific neighbours, to not only sell our goods and services, to buy theirs and also seek capital.
That's fantastic. I think, you know, one of the things about Australia that is misunderstood, I think, Brendan, is that the fact that everything that we are about is extracted from the ground.
Yes.
That it's the main breadwinner for the country, and I'm interested to know, you know, obviously we're in the age of special minerals and specialist attributes to the things that we need in the world, particularly, you know, with the advent of things like electronic vehicles and electric vehicles and more sophisticated mobile telephony and all of that. But, you know, will we run out of what's in the ground, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think it's going to last for this foreseeable future. I think one point to recognise as well is it's not only our natural endowments that are attractive to the rest of the world, be it things that we dig out of the ground, but we're also an attractive nation for foreign tourism. We do have a lot of foreign tourism, and also our skills and capability and knowledge is highly attractive from an education sector as well. But nonetheless, I still think that our extractive industries are going to be the powerhouse of this nation for the foreseeable future. In 2020, Australia was one of the top 5 global producers for around 20 mineral commodities that are produced across the world. You know, they include bauxite, cobalt, gold, and it's not just iron ore. But going forward, we're still going to need those old world minerals. But energy transition and the minerals that are going to facilitate energy transition are clearly going to be areas for Australia to be participating in from a trade perspective. We're well placed to continue with that trade relationship in that minerals extractive area. These new world minerals, Australia has the largest identified economic resources of rutile and zircon, and we've got the second largest proven resources in cobalt, ilmenite, lithium, tungsten, and vanadium. I've just read that off my list. I'm not a geologist, and so I've got a bit tongue-tied with it all. But needless to say, what that also means is that our factor endowments, our natural endowments in not only old world mining, but also new world mining is going to continue to place Australia in good stead. What that also means is that as those technologies evolve and new industries evolve, so will Australia. But we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that 75% of Australia's GDP is being generated in the services sector. So that services sector is going to be fundamental to Australia's growth, and trying to then work out our trade advantage in that services sector is also going to be really important as well.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is, of course, you know, there's that adage, you know, if you can't see it, you can't measure it. And this is the problem with the services sector, is that it's difficult to measure in its totality. But it's well known that 75 to 80% of any supply chain is actually made up of services. And so it's an essential part of that trade story as well. One of the other things I think that Australia excels at, and that's been demonstrated by a previous speaker, Neil O'Connor, who's a professor at Monash in Malaysia. And they have a large campus in Malaysia. Our MIT has a massive campus in Vietnam. Monash also has a massive campus now in Indonesia, just south of Jakarta. So education is not just about us having Asian countries send their bright young people to Australia for education. It's about us taking our educational prowess and actually working in country throughout the region. So that's very much part of the services game.
Yes.
And I think that services are, as you quite rightly say, a huge percentage, and perhaps of our GDP, and perhaps not as well understood in terms of where we are. One of the things I know that that you will talk about, or that I know you'll talk about, really is the advent of these sort of value add scenarios in Australia. And I've got a question for you too, Brendan, on this. There's a very definite government policy in Australia to diversify our trading outcomes. And I think given that we have a penchant for digging things out of the ground and selling them overseas, what do you think we can do beyond that? And what does Australia offer ASEAN and APEC and APAC, and the Pacific, of course, as well, our neighbours in the Pacific, very important and not to be ignored in this whole process. But it would be interesting to know what you think about our other items that would be worthy of consideration when thinking about Australia.
Yeah. So, Deborah, you quite well know that economists are always averse to picking winners, particularly getting government policy to pick those winners. But nonetheless, we have been spending quite a lot of time looking at future industries and where Australia can participate within that future industry global supply chain. And what we've worked out is that winning industries really in Australia have the capacity to be those that work on the same balanced level of factor inputs, both in terms of labour and capital, rather than having one industry that requires significantly one or the other, and in and of itself is likely to be a bit more risky. So those industries that we think have a nice balance of capital, knowledge and skilled labour and come from a non-mining type environment where Australia can play a strong future role, really are ones that industries like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, digital economy, energy and clean technology, and quantum science and space. We're actually seen as a leader in research and development in many of these key areas, but struggle to commercialise those after the early years of R&D at university and institutes, fundamentally because other countries around the world have a better track record in being able to take that talent offshore and turn that talent into something much more up the value added scale. So in particular, we see those as sectors and industries where where Australia can, KPMG obviously, can again participate and add value over and above, I think, other normal industries where we will continue to play a role?
There are a couple of areas, particularly I think in the financial services area, where
Yes.
there's a lot of innovation happening.
Mm.
And also I think in the creative industries, the sort of technology output to creativity, like the Canvas of this world. We do have quite a few unicorns rolling around the place. That have their services outside. But you're right, commercialization of IP and at university research really is has sort of, would I say, not failed, but not really done as best it could. For instance, you know, the octopus card in Hong Kong, the store value card that everybody uses for everything, is actually Australian technology from Perth. Yep. Which we didn't commercialize. It was actually bought by the MTR Corporation and commercialized by them. So, you know, there are opportunities. There are a significant number of high-level research facilities in Australian universities doing amazing work. And I think also one of the things that is perhaps the platform for rapprochement with China, between Australia and China, will be in clean technology. I think there are a number of activities already taking place. In fact, I know this is true for universities in Australia, where they're actually working with other universities around the world to develop technologies around the sustainability factor. If you could wave a magic wand,
yep,
and say, okay, well, you've said we need investors in Australia, we need foreign capital, we need, in order to be able to do the things that we do and to excel at them, we need to attract capital.
Yep.
Where would you say the strengths are for Asian investors into Australia in terms of putting their capital to work?
So as you say, Australia will continue to need foreign capital to help grow and develop our economy into the future. The situation where our savings levels are insufficient to meet our capital needs is always going to continue. There's more opportunities than we've actually got cash at the bank to deal with those opportunities. In terms of Asian investors, I think it's really important, if I were in those shoes, to consider investments where they've had proven experience, both from an investor and investee perspective. So what comes to mind automatically are things like commercial property, agriculture, but some of these won't change necessarily within the evolving landscape. You're always going to need investment within those traditional sectors. But big picture items and big picture ideas and new technologies for the new world are also going to need large tranches of capital as well. If you think about energy transition, you know, renewable generation automatically comes to mind. You know, it's not just that we have the factor endowments of things that sit in the earth, but we also have factor endowments, like you said, of large tracts of land with no population, and a landscape that attracts the sun, that attracts the wind, that attracts natural forces that you can capture into some form of energy. And the other thing is not only that generation, we also need to enhance our transmission networks to allow for that renewable generation to be utilised and harnessed properly. I mean, for example, a great energy generation idea is the Sun Cable project that's looking to capture, you know, energy from the sun transported to Darwin and then on to Singapore. And that's planned to occur within this next few years. And it's going to be projects like that that I think show Australia's true potential to operate in this new energy environment and not only meet our own energy demands, but those from offshore as well. Other areas as well that I think capital is going to be required, and again, we've got good history in that, is in the health sector. We've got an aging population where different models of care are going to be required, and that different models of care are going to require different sorts of infrastructure. We've been doing work with various health providers in Australia looking at the transition from some surgery where you'd be required to stay in hospital for 3 to 5 days for that surgery now occurring in a day hospital, and then your convalescence is going to occur at home. So in and of itself, it needs to have day hospitals getting built. You need to have ancillary support like transport getting built as well. And also the other areas of just technology requiring different forms of communication as we uprate and upskill our communication, 5G, 6G, how many Gs we go to, is going to require different forms of communication, different forms of pipes that allow that to happen, and also non-pipes, so satellites and the like. But fundamentally, from an Asian investor perspective, again, I think there's so many opportunities, but one of the things that they will need to be cognizant of is the rules around foreign investment in Australia. And we have, quite transparent rule-based mechanism through our Foreign Investment Review Board. And there are recognition that approval is required for purchases of foreigners in interests like agricultural land, mining land, tenements, commercial land, residential land, regardless of what that value is. And the government does need to cast its eye on those investments on a case-by-case basis, and recognising that there is a flexible approach to that as well.
Going back to the Sun Cable example, which I think is a prime example of Australia's ingenuity, both looking at the resource-rich environment that we have, meaning sunshine, and solar panels and land. So this is a massive undertaking. In fact, I think it's regarded as the largest infrastructure project in Australia for many years to come. And its output in terms of delivering renewable energy via cable to Singapore will actually provide Singapore with 40% of its renewable energy, which is just staggering. And I know, absolutely staggering. And I know that Sun Cable is now also in talks with Indonesia as well. So these are countries. Indonesia is a country where power generation is a problem, and it holds back its manufacturing entities, and it holds back the economy to some extent. And Australia could be a solution provider in that area, which is really quite remarkable. It is. I suggest that you take a look, that you Google Sun Cable and have a look at what they're doing. It's quite remarkable. It would be interesting. It's interesting to also note that the chairman of Sun Cable, not that it was his idea, but he's the chairman now, and he's the chairman of. He's a guy called Mike Cannon-Brookes, and he just bought he's just taken over running Australia's largest energy provider. So it's very interesting. All roads lead back to sustainability, and I think you'll see that that's what's happening in Australia with the new government policy in that area. We've got just a few minutes, but there is another innovation that I'd love to talk to you about, Brendan, and that's green hydrogen, and the discussion around green hydrogen is worldwide, and Australia is another billionaire in Australia, a guy called Andrew Forrest, Twiggy Forrest, is sort of driving through his Fortescue Future Industries, which is actually now being run in Southeast Asia by a former friend from Hong Kong. Well, he's not a former friend, but he's formerly of Hong Kong. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on green hydrogen as well.
Well, so first and foremost, I think that I can say that I personally am a fan of hydrogen as an energy source. And I first became probably more attuned to hydrogen as an energy source when I worked on the feasibility study in 2014 for the hydrogen energy supply chain project that's based in the Latrobe Valley. It's not a green hydrogen project. It uses brown coal as its feedstock, but nonetheless, that experience and understanding hydrogen as a renewable energy source really had me converted as that being the ideal type of new future energy source that the world really needs to latch onto. In terms of green hydrogen, what that does, in my view, is it combines the best of everything that Australia can provide as a developing nation or a developer nation for these new fuel sources. We just mentioned about Sun Cables and its connection to using solar energy, and really green hydrogen. The concept behind green hydrogen is using renewable energy sources as the basis in which to create the hydrogen itself. And Australia has many, many different forms of renewable energy, not at least the most, I think, powerful one is solar. And so creating green energy, green hydrogen using renewable energy has become one of our key policy priorities in Australia. They're talking about a green hydrogen hub in Townsville, as well as in other areas around the country, including the Gladstone, and that's where Twiggy Forrest is talking about, the Hunter, Bell Bay in Tasmania, and also in the Pilbara. And so it just seems to me the natural marriage of renewable energy sources that are in fact created by other renewable energy sources, and seems to be absolutely the way of the future. But again, all of this is capital intensive, highly expensive, and Australia as a provider of this isn't going to be able to do it by itself, and it's going to need foreign capital to enable it to occur.
Thanks, Brendan. On that note, we are out of time, but I do urge you all to consider Australia and to look at what Australia is doing in these spaces, in all of these different spaces, because we are, as we often say about ourselves, punching somewhat above our weight. So please do look at take a look at what Australia is doing in these fields, and where we can actually be of support and help to you. So today, thank you very much, Brendan, and
thank you, Deborah.
PBEC. You're welcome, and thanks to PBEC. And that's our time is up. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.